Great, thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Thanks everybody for making time in what's otherwise quite an interesting setting for lots of other reasons. I'm going to, because I've had a lot of connection problems, kill my camera for now, and in the hope that that'll make things run more smoothly. So I hope that people can see my screen. I'm assuming that they can. Please shout if you can't.
Yes, I can, yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so thanks for the introduction. Thank you so much for organizing this conference and for doing me the honor of inviting me to speak. I was very impressed by yesterday's presentations and by the questions, and hope that I can live up at least to last night's performance, although I'm sure Abby will, definitely. I'm going to consider predictive processing in the context of the quickly growing field of computational psychiatry. And I'll come to what I mean by those terms in a minute. To begin with, I just want to acknowledge very importantly that the thoughts I'm going to present to you, and that it's large talk, are not really original. They've emerged from years of discussion with lots of people, and particularly what I'm going to talk about this evening relates to discussions and arguments and conversations, and recently a paper that I've produced with Christoph Teufel, who's now in Cardiff. Just to clarify, when I'm talking about predictive processing, and this may well be unnecessary for you, but I think it's useful to clarify at the outset. I'm thinking about this framework based around the principle that organisms, when they try to uncover the structures of their surroundings through sensory inputs, use prior information to resolve ambiguity. In doing so, they can build and use models to regulate their interactions with the world. And when I talk about computational psychiatry, I'm talking about a broad attempt to elucidate at multiple scales the apparent or the aberrant computations that might underlie symptoms and experiences of mental illness. And I'm focusing on particularly the use of computational frameworks inspired by predictive processing's treatment of perception, actions, and beliefs. So I'm looking at that area of the Venn diagram where computational psychiatry and predictive processing meet. This is a broad overview of what I'm going to cover. As I said, it's largely conceptual. I want to begin by just presenting very briefly what I would normally expand on in an hour-long talk, but for purposes this evening, I'm just going to very briefly touch on it. And that's what is the appeal of predictive processing to a psychiatrist like me? And it really includes the need for a framework, the possibility of bridging explanatory gaps, and also the fact that it encompasses biopsychosocial models. I want to then turn to some current criticisms, which I think are very, very sharp and to the point, and use those as a basis for a springboard for thinking about how we can turn them into some useful questions, which I'm framing around three dichotomies. I'm dichotomizing them for simplicity, although I don't really believe they exist as simple matters of black and white. So to begin with, let's think about the appeal to the psychiatrist. If we take as a very good example of the challenges that we face in psychiatry, the syndrome that many find most baffling of schizophrenia. Now, this is a complex, sometimes devastating constellation of experiences that can affect perception, inference, belief, action, ultimately a person's whole reality and their model of the world. Now, the notion of schizophrenia does draw criticisms, and indeed it does likely subsume a number of different entities with differing causes, but it also draws ill-informed critiques, I think, that stem from a lack of clinical experience and a poorly informed thinking about how it's used practically. But the real challenge for me with it, and with many psychiatric syndromes, is to find credible models to help us understand the array of symptoms and experiences. And when I say understand, I mean at a biological, at a psychological, at a social level. Because all of these levels are indisputably potential causes and consequences of mental illness, and in this case, schizophrenia. And it seems to me that the predictive processing framework is beautifully aligned with that as an aspiration, because it concerns itself with the agent making sense of and modeling the world, and with using models to optimize its impact on the world and the world's impact upon it as an agent. And also, there's a profound problem that's really dogged psychiatry or cognitive neuroscience generally, and that's the lack of a common currency that can link biology, psychology, social levels of explanation. And this explanatory gap has profoundly limited the capacity of techniques such as functional imaging, for example, to make any truly useful contribution to understanding the nature of mental illness. And I think that predictive processing offers a way of beginning to bridge that gap in a way that meaningfully includes all of the levels. So there are good grounds for me as a psychiatrist for wanting to embrace it or something like it and to see what it can offer us. And many people in the field have taken this and really run with it. And I'm just throwing up 3 examples of papers that I consider very, very interesting in the field. Papers that have attempted to model delusions or aberrant beliefs and hallucinations and talked in terms of altered prior expectations as a means of understanding these. But at the same time, there are current criticisms. And I think common to those criticisms are a number of key points. Firstly, the idea that there is a loose, imprecise thinking around core principles of predictive processing, that there's frequently an overstatement of its scope, that there can be flawed approaches to establishing empirical support for it and to linking it to mechanisms. A couple of examples of this. One you'll see Andy's actually an author on, which I think is a very healthy sign in the field if people who carry the banner for a technique are also willing advocates of criticizing it. So Litvin and Milkovsky make some very telling and quite, shall we say, robustly phrased critiques. And I just want to quote from one of this paper here. They say, predictive processing remains only loosely connected both to its computational framework and to its hypothetical biological underpinnings. Its models are seldom empirically validated, and they're frequently offered as mere just-so stories. The gap between theory and its biological computational bases contributes to the arrested development of predictive processing as a unificatory theory. Defenders should focus on its critical problems instead of offering mere redescriptions of known phenomena. Now, in the paper by Walsh and others, they say that without question, predictive processing can accommodate neurophysiological observations, but in reality, few studies have set out to explicitly test hypotheses that are unique to predictive processing, and many empirical observations interpreted as supporting predictive processing are derived from paradigms that are ill-equipped to discriminate among competing models. So these are the sort of the flavors of criticism that I think have commonalities and that are very, very important to address sincerely. And I think computational psychiatry draws those and lots of other criticisms that I won't go into. So let's think about them in terms of what I consider to be core questions that we should be addressing and thinking about. And to some extent, these have been addressed, as I'll show you. So let's take first the idea of predictive coding versus predictive processing as terms that are often used interchangeably. Now, the first explicit mention I came across of this distinction was actually in Andy's 2013 paper, in which he very clearly proposes predictive processing as a broader framework, but one that is not dissociated from predictive coding. So he says, in referring to predictive processing, he is, quote, not simply referring to the use of data compression strategy known as predictive coding, rather it is the use of that strategy in the special context of hierarchical systems deploying probabilistic generative models. So predictive coding and predictive processing are linked very strongly, but then they're not the same. And there's a lovely paper from 2017 I draw your attention to by Aitchison and Lengyel, in which they examine this linkage, this connection very closely. And the central message is that they acknowledge that the two theories have been combined into one framework. So predictive processing plus Bayesian inference equals Bayesian predictive coding, or I think we can reasonably say predictive processing. And in this instance, predictive coding refers to the prediction error of the input rather than the input itself is represented and fed forward, and this is efficient. It leads to a reduction in spike transmission cost. Bayesian inference, on the other hand, they call us, they suggest that Bayesian inference of latent causes of sensory input is one of the brain's ultimate goals. They acknowledge that since uncertainty is an ubiquitous feature of neural processing, we usually don't know the latent causes of our incoming sense data, and Bayes' rule provides an optimal solution to this. So, what they're saying is that the latent variables that are inferred through Bayesian inference are what provide the predictions that are required for predictive coding. And the prediction error generated by predictive coding, that's calculated through that process, forms the input to the neural circuit carrying out the Bayesian inference that guides the network dynamics towards activity patterns that better represent our sensory input. But, and this is key to their paper, what they're worried about is that predictive coding specifies that prediction errors should be represented, but it's agnostic as to where the predictions come from. So predictive coding, they say, is an algorithmic or representational motif that can serve several different goals. Bayesian inference is just one. Conversely, Bayesian inference offers the optimal calculus for computing predictions, but it doesn't specify the neural representations. Bayesian inference is the computational goal. So should we worry about locking together these two essentially dissociable ideas? I don't think we should. I think it's an instance where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But I think we should be aware of what we're doing, and we should be explicit about it. So as Aitchison and Lengyel make the point, the prediction error generated by predictive coding does not necessarily entail Bayesian inference. They suggest that in the retina, it goes on, and in force cancellation models, it goes on without recourse to Bayesian inference. And conversely, Bayesian inference can proceed without necessarily invoking predictive coding. So that's the take-home message. My point is that it's potentially important, especially for those of us who pose clinical questions within the context, for example, of computational psychiatry, and who therefore seek some sort of mechanistic insight, need to be mindful of the fact that when we bandy terms around, we're bringing separate ideas together. And we have to handle these bundles of ideas with great care. Otherwise, we end up jumping to conclusions. Now, another fundamental tension or question or dichotomy is another, for me, really interesting one. It's the question of suppression of signal versus enhancement. And I just want to cover that briefly because I think it's very relevant to these questions about mechanisms. So I'm going to focus in this brief section on the mechanisms of the signal and examine this tension that I think arises if we focus solely on prediction error as the feed-forward signal. And it feels like focusing solely on prediction error as the feed-forward signal might be a necessary commitment if we talk about predictive coding, hierarchical or otherwise. And this is one area where I think we need to be mindful of our language. So this is a paradox arising that has been very nicely outlined by Press, Koch, and Yon in a recent TICS paper. And it really, it starts with the idea that as we all acknowledge, the idea of suppression or explaining away introduces a very alluring idea of a system that has configured itself to a situation and doesn't really want to be wasting energy on old news. It sort of responds to mismatches to the configuration, either by ignoring them or by revising predictions or by acting on the world to change them, but it doesn't want to worry too much about what it already knows. But this creates a tension, Press and colleagues argue, with how we know that perceptual systems work insofar as the evidence that they enhance expected signals, not just suppress or explain away unexpected ones. A couple of papers I'll just flash up that provide quite recent evidence of this enhancement of using top-down knowledge of expected rather than unexpected signals. I don't want to go into details of data on this, but Getting back to this paper, Press and colleagues articulate this paradox quite nicely. They say that the essence of Bayesian theories is to nurture and enhance signals that accord with our generative models. And this leads to biases in how we report the presence of these signals, increased sensitivity to the signals, increased clarity of perception of those signals. But conversely, cancellation, what they refer to as cancellation theories, concern themselves with promoting efficiency by cancelling out expected signals. This is the essence of their paradox. You know, how can you have both? And they resolve it rather by appealing to what they refer to as opposing processes. So they distinguish between inference in learning and in perception, learning being concerned with how we update our models, perceptual inference being concerned with the here and now. And they suggest that two processes happen. There's the initial processing, which leans towards expected signals, but if there's a sufficiently strong prediction error, that triggers later processes that highlight unexpectedness and may lead to learning. So as they eloquently phrase it, in short, we broadly perceive what we expect unless we have good reason not to. Now, this actually is dealt with nicely in Andy's more recent book, Surfing Uncertainty, in which he refers to the duplex architecture of the hierarchical predictive processing system, where we have these bundles of error units and representation units. And he says that naturally leads to the free gift of enhancement, because alongside suppression, predictive processing delivers sharpening and selective enhancement. The key suppression or explaining away relates to the prediction error, but, and this is key, cancelling error unit activity, the laterally connected representation units are freed up, so we have selective enhancement. Now, I think that both of these resolutions to this apparent dilemma are highly complementary. I think that they offer a very nice, mechanistically orientated perspective on how the balance between two seemingly competing demands might be achieved. So we have a predisposition to the expected that simultaneously suppresses the unexpected and enhances the expected. But we also have within this system a sort of an opening of the door to the possibility that an unexpected signal can just elbow its way in. So here, both perspectives, both Andy's and Claire Press's and others, refers to precision as a core parameter that can imbue the mismatch or prediction error signal with sufficient strength to muscle its way in. And presumably, this would suppress the representation units at the same time for the expected signal that is not materializing, but also percolate up to the next level where it can fight its next battle against expectation. So I think, having considered the two fundamental tensions that have a real meaning for mechanistic aspects of the predictive processing framework, I now want to turn in the longer section to something that has been nagging away at me and my colleague Christoph Teufel for a long time. And this concerns the nature of the predictions themselves, and specifically a sense of disquiet that he and I have had, and I think probably a number of people have had, at the almost ubiquitous tendency to conceptualize the influence of predictions exclusively in terms of top-down processes. Now, I want to be clear here, I'm not saying anybody has stated these are the only types of prediction, but it's almost invariable that if you find the word prediction in papers, you will find the phrase top-down not very far from it. And I think that's potentially problematic. Because the idea is upheld that predictions in higher level areas always exert their influence on lower level areas within an information processing hierarchy, which I think is true, but not exclusively so. So I want to think about the importance of another form of predictive information that is perhaps written more deeply, perhaps etched or ingrained might be a better word, into the agent and could be embedded maybe ineluctably into the bottom-up stream of information processing. I want to think about this in terms of the nature of the distinction that we're making, the evidence for differing mechanisms for prediction, and the value of making this distinction. And this is the paper that Christoph and I produced earlier this year. And as I said, it was the result of many years of conversation with Christoph, who was a wonderful postdoc in my lab and is now doing excellent work in Cardiff. And I have to be perfectly honest, so much of the thinking that went into this originated with Christoph, and it's important to acknowledge that. So firstly, what do we actually mean when we talk about prediction in this paper? Well, what we're essentially saying is that prediction is an estimate of an unobserved or missing information piece on the basis of a model, with the model itself based on prior knowledge of the world. Now, we say that prediction can be, but is not necessarily future orientated. And you may want to return to that in questions if you disagree. But the question that we framed is, are we comprehensive in detailing the possible mechanisms of prediction and what might be gained by refining our view of prediction? And this, I hope you don't mind, begins with something of a digression. I hope it doesn't feel too self-indulgent to you. I can assure you that it was one that we both enjoyed, but also felt was important. So in many ways, my conversations with Christoph and the ensuing article that I've alluded to were inspired by reading the predominantly British mid-20th century cyberneticists, most notably Ross Ashby. But we also thought about the notion of the Umwelt as articulated by Jakob von Uexküll, the Balkan German biologist at the turn of the sort of 1900s. I think he died in 1944. And this notion of an Umwelt is that of an environment determined by the nature and morphometry, that is, by the sensing and responding repertoire of the agent itself. So von Uexküll discussed the Umwelt of the tick at great length, and I just want to go into that. This is a translation from a copy that I have of A Stroll Through the World of Humans and Animals, or Animals and Humans. And he says, the tick hangs on the tip of a branch in a forest clearing. Its position allows it to fall onto a mammal running past. From its entire environment, no stimulus penetrates the tick. But here comes a mammal. Of all the effects emanating from the mammal's body, only 3 become stimuli. And the 3 he's referring to here are the odor of butyric acid from the mammal's sweat, the warmth of the mammal's body when it drops onto it, and the sense of touch as it looks for a patch of hair-free skin. So he goes on to say, from the enormous world surrounding the tick, 3 stimuli glow like signal lights. The whole rich world of the tick is constricted and transformed into an impoverished structure. And so this is what von Uexküll means by the tick's Umwelt. The agent's Umwelt comprises the elements of the environment that carry significance for that agent. And it denotes a consideration of the features of the world, but crucially of the embedded constraints of the agent itself. So you can note that 2 agents can inhabit precisely the same environment, but have very radically different Umwelten. So in the work of, turning to Ross Ashby, of the cyberneticists, we see a strongly related idea, I think, and this is that the nature or the repertoire of the agent is intimately related to its world. And I think it's worth a brief digression on that, of how cyberneticists formulated this idea. So the term itself derived, which I think was introduced by Norbert Wiener, means the science of communication and control, and it derives from the Greek for steersman, hence the picture here. And it captures the idea that a successful agent has to control or govern the effects of its environment, not necessarily by constraining that environment, but by responding adaptively to changes in the relevant parameters, so that the steersman responds to salient parameters such as breezes, currents, eddies, tides, turbulence, so forth, by making adjustments in its own self that mitigate their impact on the desired course. In this case of the boat, but it's a metaphor, of course. So what these ideas are introducing is an intimate relationship between the nature of the agent and its world. And out of cybernetics, certainly from Ross Ashby's work, arrived 2 really interesting principles or laws, the law of requisite variety and the good regulator theorem. And I'll just briefly touch on them. they're very strongly interrelated. In fact, to be quite honest, I can't quite tell them apart. But the law of requisite variety, which has to be summed up as saying variety can destroy variety, or as Stafford Beer later put it, variety absorbs variety. It's essentially, if we think of variety as the number of states that a system can visit, essentially the law is that an agent within that system must have a repertoire of states at least equal to the number of ways that the environment can influence it. Now, this refers to the agent's capacity to maintain its own parameters within acceptable limits. So the number of states it must have relate to the number of ways that the environment can perturb it. The good regulator theorem, on the other hand, simply states that to be a good regulator of your environment, you must be a model of it. You must be able to recapitulate within your own structure and function the regularities within that environment. And I think this is, these ideas are really important because on one hand, they suggest that we can scrutinize the regularities of the world in order to shed light on the nature of the agent and the predictions in the agent. We can also learn more about the agent by examining its Umwelt and its environment. And for the psychiatrists, I think it offers us different ways of framing the idea of mental illness, perhaps even thinking in terms of them as altered Umwelten. So, taking that idea forward, what are the regularities in our world? And Christoph and I thought, actually, there's an important distinction to be made, which is not often made. Because on the one hand, we have spatio-temporally global regularities that are relevant to every encounter between the agent and its environment. And these are independent of context, so they're not hierarchical. Conversely, we have spatially temporally local regularities, which impact on the agent only in specific contexts. And these are necessarily nested within a hierarchy. And regularities are there to be exploited. That's what good agents do. So the consequences for the agent are that it, in relation to the spatio-temporally global regularities, it should possess context-independent, non-hierarchical predictions that act automatically and perhaps ineluctably. They should determine the fundamental interaction with the world at all times. Conversely, for the spatio-temporally local, context-dependent regularities, the agent should possess this hierarchical system of predictions, higher-level information processing mechanisms, resulting predictions back to lower-level units. In other words, the traditional predictive processing or hierarchical predictive coding. Now, in the paper, we struggled for terminology in relation to these two types of predictions and came up with the idea of something from visual computational field, the idea of constraints or embedded constraints. We were trying to capture the notion that the structure of the nervous system forces information processing to proceed along predetermined paths, just as von Uexküll argued with the tick. And for the other more traditional ones, we came up with the term expectations. So I just want to focus on embedded constraints primarily, because I think these are the ones that are neglected in most treatments of predictive processing. I think they arise from the fact that certainly in vision, even seemingly different scenes show overlap in their statistical properties, overlap relating to orientation of local edges in natural scenes, the shapes of contours, the positions of objects, possibly even stimulus associability. So as an example, we can look at a series of scenes and we might find context-dependent regularities of local orientation. It probably hasn't come out too well here, I'm afraid, but the hills, this is on the right of the image, the hills or the orientation of the chin of the small boy. These are context. They wouldn't be there if for example, the small boy wasn't in the picture. But if you look more broadly at scenes like this, what you will find to the left there is an enhanced probability of certain orientations that are there no matter what, these probabilities. And it happens to be the case that there's a higher probability of orientation in cardinal directions, vertical or horizontal, context independent. And focusing on these, there's great work by Gershik and others in Nature Neuroscience 2011, in which they pointed this out, that the distribution of context-independent regularities of local or edge orientation seem to follow these 90 degrees and 180 degrees, or vertical and horizontal. And furthermore, that the tuning properties of V1 orientation-sensitive neurons are biased towards these more frequently encountered orientations. The neurons tuned to these orientations are overrepresented, and they have a narrower tuning function. So essentially, what we're seeing is a structural feature of the visual system that mirrors the structural features of the world outside, the context-independent structural features of the world outside. And we're seeing a way that Bayesian inference could be performed in the absence of any explicit representation of a prior in a top-down hierarchy. Now, this may also apply to other things like speed of, this is suggested. Another way in which we find these context-independent features is in grouping and segregating and of objects. So, for example, with respect to contours and association fields, when we extract contours, the visual system uses prior information on typical contour shape to group local information that might be occluded into larger units or so-called association fields. And it's been shown that the horizontal connectivity patterns in V1 can provide a plausible and simple mechanism for implementation of these predictions. Again, structurally embedded constraints ensure that local orientation information is integrated, and this is done without the need for top-down predictions. Although I should point out it's likely to be complemented by additional flexible top-down influences. So I'm not suggesting that it's one thing or the other. And I draw your attention to a nice review by Geisler in Annual Review of Psychology 2008. Also, with respect to grouping and segregating is the notion of border ownership. So the figure on the left is a well-known bistable image where you might see either two faces or a central goblet or pillar, depending on to what object you attribute the contour. And it's inherently ambiguous there, but in general, in the real world, contour attribution is made more possible by broader context. So if you think of, let's say, if you look at the images on the right, there are, within the circle are, that represents the receptive field of a V2 neuron that is sensitive to a contour or an edge. Now, the information actually reaching that neuron is identical in all of those images, but depending on the broader extra receptive field information, outside of its receptive field, I should say, then the contour can be determined by that broader pattern. So if you look at C and G, they're very, very similar, but in one case, even though the neuron itself is receiving identical information, where it attributes the contour to, or where the system attributes the contour to, is different in C and G. So essentially, border ownership signaled by the V2 neuron depends on information coming from outside their classical receptive field. And Li Xiaoping has made a very nice computational model that shows that V2 can generate ownership signal by itself without requiring a top-down mechanism. Border ownership signals that model physiological observations can arise, he suggests, through finite range intra-areal interactions. I think this is really interesting as a psychiatrist, because all of these phenomena relate to how we would separate figure ground, how we would experience objects. And if you actually look to descriptions that people with early stages of schizophrenia give of how they perceive the world visually, there's a lot of instances, although you don't find these in the DSM categorizations or in a lot of textbooks, the first person reports from old papers such as the ones from the 1960s here show clear evidence that they're having a real trouble partitioning objects and telling the figure from the ground. And I'm raising that just as a sort of interesting phenomenon, and it's worth mentioning that well, this is a just so story, but I do think that we may have to look at these phenomena in order to understand the full pictures of, for example, the early stages of schizophrenia. Now, another phenomenon that's worth alluding to in respect of these context-independent predictions or regularities relates to the position of objects in the world. And Kaiser and colleagues presented a very nice overview in Ticks in 2019. And it suggests that even beyond the level of just basic orientations, contours, and whole object properties, there are non-contextual regularities relating to object position, non-contextually dependent regularities. So, for example, they point out, we see advantages for objects when they're placed in their correct positions in a scene in the first 140 milliseconds of visual processing. So this is before perceptual object recognition. Kaiser and colleagues point out this suggests that location biases reflect neural tuning during perceptual stimulus analysis rather than solely based on post-perceptual feedback. So essentially, population receptive field mapping studies, they suggest, shows a startling functional correspondence between receptive field organization and category selectivity across high-level vision, unquote. What this is essentially saying is that receptive field properties of different category selective regions are biased towards those parts of the visual field that typically where those objects are encountered. So the overall conclusion from this sort of rather rushed overview of natural scene statistics and visual system is that there are time and space invariant statistical regularities of environmental properties that are implicitly encoded in stable structural components of the information processing system. And the resulting predictions, I don't think should be seen as top-down effects. I think they constrain bottom-up information processing by essentially by forcing them in a particular direction and acting in a sort of embedded way. More broadly, I think it's worth noting that there's a real breadth of elegant work on natural scene statistics that is telling us something fundamental about the nature of how the brain is structurally and functionally organized, just as really the cyberneticists were suggesting, and von Ertzkool, that you can learn about the agent by examining its place in its environment. Now, speculatively, I think we can take this beyond basic perception, and a good example of this comes from the notion of prepared learning. For those who don't know, prepared learning refers to an inborn, presumably evolutionarily determined variability in our readiness to form associations between certain types of stimuli and outcomes. So the classic paper by Garcia and Curling in the 1960s showed something very interesting, that if you take rats and you pair a taste and an audio-visual stimulus with a toxin, then the rat tends to associate the toxin or the aversive outcome to the gustatory, the taste stimulus, but not to the auditory visual one. On the other hand, if you pair a shock with the taste and the audio-visual stimulus, the rat tends to form the association to the audio-visual stimulus, but not to the taste, suggesting that there's a sort of inbuilt tendency towards associating certain stimuli with certain outcomes. Now, Dunlap and Stevens in 2014 showed that if you take two groups of Drosophila and you pair an aversive chemical stimulus, in this case quinine, with a visual stimulus in one group and an olfactory stimulus in another, after 40 generations, the insects have actually evolved into two different lines. One has a readiness to form associations to the auditory cue, and one has a readiness to form associations to the olfactory cue. They have this innate tendency. Now, this paper's been criticized that it doesn't really look at prepared learning, but I still think that the finding suggests that something relatively high level, such as stimulus associability, may actually become an embedded constraint as we've described it. So overall, I think it seems compelling that embedding prediction in constraints on bottom-up processing allows a maximization of information content and performance and reduces metabolic cost. Now, I'm not going to talk about top-down context-dependent predictions because I think you'll have heard a lot about them already. But I think it's clear to me that this is mechanistically distinct from the more widely discussed top-down context-dependent predictions. But the question arises, and I think it's a very good question, is it actually useful to make this distinction between constraints and the more commonly recognized or discussed top-down effects produced by this hierarchical context-dependent system? Now, I think one might plausibly argue that it's not. It's a bit unnecessary. It's just hair splitting, because we're talking ultimately about a normative framework that is really all about facilitating inference about the state of the world and different forms of prediction. Be that as it may, they all serve the same purpose, irrespective of their mechanism. But I don't buy that, and I suspect you don't either, because I think many of us want to make a further mechanistic commitment for a number of reasons. In my case, because I think psychiatry needs mechanistic commitment. And if we are aiming for that, then I think an apparently default assumption that predictions are top-down will ultimately lead us astray. So I want to just give two sets of examples about why I think it's important. So firstly, the idea of linking computational models to mechanisms. And let's start with the question of, well, I'm going to cover both of these things at once, really, both illusions and priors, and interesting questions about how these constraints and these expectations may interact. Highly speculative, I'm afraid. So if we think about illusions and biases, illusions tend to arise when sensory inputs are deliberately manufactured predictions of our perceptual systems. And they are almost invariably conceptualized within the field as resulting from top-down processing. So in the corn suite illusion, where this is the top left here, you've got two adjacent equiluminant patterns. They're separated by a graded section. And a consequence of that is that they appear to, but they don't really differ in their luminance. Now, this is largely treated as an illustration of top-down influences. It's been broadly simulated as such in very elegant ways. But in fact, there's evidence to suggest that the effect is due to predictive information that's actually embedded in very early subcortical, even retinal processes. And it's been linked to the receptive field properties of retinal ganglion cells, which are not receiving this top-down hierarchical expectations. Similarly, the Muller-Lyer illusion on the right, very well-known illusion, and well, almost invariably attracts this top-down perspective-based interpretation. You know, we think in terms of corners sticking out or sticking in and related to our prior experience of buildings and things. Now that doesn't work because actually Gandhi and others showed in 2015 that the Muller-Lyer illusion is found in congenitally blind people just after they've had sight restoring surgery. People have not had access to these phenomena, or to this higher level prior knowledge. And then there's the light from above prior, which gives rise to a number of illusions. And essentially, I mean, as you see here, most of us will see some of these dimples as sticking out and others as being concave. And that's largely because of the way the light is represented and our own bias to think that light comes from above. So this can be, and often is, explained in terms of top-down effects. And it's very important to acknowledge that it can be modified by experience, which would be in keeping with the notion of flexible, context-dependent top-down effects. But that occurs in the face of something important, that if you do expectations about where the light is coming from through, say, a lab experiment, the modified prior that they have is specific to that lab setting. And the normal light from above expectations will predominate outside of that setting. So this would actually be consistent with something more nuanced, which is that the light from above effect can emerge from an embedded constraint, that experimental training can produce a novel context-specific expectation, but it doesn't modify the original, more general constraint. And this, of course, raises the interesting question about how what we're calling expectations and what we're calling constraints might interact. So perhaps, maybe that there's a limited amount of interaction could actually strike a nice balance between robustness and flexibility, and that could allow for context-dependent modulation of the expression of the effects of the constraints. So it's nice to think of these two types of prediction or two types of predictive mechanism having some touch points. Interestingly, actually, it's been shown that in the case of the light from above prior, that it's species specific in some ways, because chickens have a light from above prior that's totally immutable. They're unable to acquire a context-dependent modulation, even if they're reared entirely in a setting where the light is coming from below. So this really powerfully illustrates how predictive information could be decoupled entirely from an agent's actual experience of the world after birth. Now, on to something that's close to my heart, is I think the distinction is potentially crucial if we're going to make progress in computational psychiatry. Now, I think that the use of predictive processing within psychiatry has borne some real fruit and has inspired some very new ways of thinking about how symptoms emerge and how they may be linked to neurobiology and more broadly to, I think the approach actually paradoxically almost forces biological psychiatry to remember the importance of considering the agent in the world. But I think a broadening of our perspective on prediction to recognize this distinction between constraints and expectations might offer certain new avenues to explore. I think we need to be very wary of models, of building models that can capture symptoms in terms of higher computational explanations, but don't connect us to the underlying mechanisms, because I think that can lead us astray. So I'm going to just briefly give three examples of where I think recognizing the distinction could ultimately prove helpful. So firstly, this notion of different mechanisms underlying common symptom clusters. So a current challenge in neuropsychiatry relates to a lot of clinical overlap between different forms of psychosis where people are sort of separated from reality, occurring in the context of classically defined mental illness such as schizophrenia versus the more recently recognized, for example, autoantibody mediated psychosis, where somebody might have IgA antibodies to their NMDA receptors. Now this poses a real clinical dilemma, because clinically, phenomenologically, it might be very difficult to tell them apart, but actually the treatments for those two forms of psychosis are very, very different. Now, a single computational model could actually explain both of the psychosis in both cases perfectly adequately, but it would only be by getting at the underlying mechanisms that we could inform clinical decisions. I think that's key, and that's why I'm, and many others are, interested in mechanisms. I think we can add mechanistic constraints to ambiguous computational perspectives in a related way. So thinking about hallucinations, which we know have many physiological underpinnings. So we've already seen quite widely how predictive processing can account for hallucinations very well, but it also can allow room for ambiguities about what the fundamental perturbation might be. So some models posit that there's an overweighting of top-down processing, and others have emphasized that there's reduced efficacy of predictions, in other words, an underweighting of top-down processing. And this latter idea has been partly inspired by observations that there's an apparent resistance to illusions in schizophrenia, which would be suggestive of a failure to apply top-down signals in order to impose predictions on inputs, at least according to the standard top-down model of how illusions work. Now, the field as a whole has dealt with this by imagining that top-down processes at lower levels might be weaker and top-down processes at higher levels might be overweighted. And this account is really quite restricted by a lack of clarity on what we actually mean by low and high levels. But it also fails to acknowledge, I think, that illusions may not be top-down, as I've described. They may not involve expectations, but they may involve constraints. So it may be that acknowledging different forms of predictions can make more sense of the fact that people with hallucinations are relatively resistant to illusions while at the same time experiencing hallucinations. Again, it's very speculative at the moment, but I think it's pointing in that direction. And then finally, and very briefly on that, making sense of what are essentially neglected symptoms. So I've already alluded to some of the perceptual disturbances that in themselves can be very nebulous, ill-defined, not featured in the diagnostic processes, and they tend not to come within the purview of computational psychiatric approaches. But actually the mechanisms of prediction I've alluded to relating to orientation, shapes of contours, object positions, they may well provide the necessary extension of the predictive processing lexicon in order to allow a consideration of these phenomena in more detail. And it's important to note that clinically orientated visual neuroscientists, people like Stephen Dakin, have already done excellent work in this area outside the domain of predictive processing by recognizing these non-top-down effects of visual processing. So in drawing to a close, I just want to make a couple of key points. I think, as I've said, indubitably, predictive processing framework, which I think has a really impressive pedigree rooted in information theory, cybernetics, reinforcement learning, telecommunications, lots of fields, has really inspired and shaped a nascent field of psychiatry, so-called computational psychiatry. Although it's not had a clinical impact, but it is generating a really innovative and exciting body of research into how symptoms and syndromes might emerge out of altered integration of the biological, psychological, and social factors. Now, we've known for a long time that these factors are crucial, but so far most of the rather arid debate about their impact has circled around, which levels are the key one, and we get separation of the biological psychiatrists and the social psychiatrists, and it's all very unhelpful. I think at its best, predictive processing framework rejects this and places itself at the point of interaction between these levels. And implicitly, it refuses to assign precedence to any particular one of them. And I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge. But I also think that the cost of wielding its broad explanatory power is very high, and it comes with the requirement for a huge degree of diligence, that when we do provide explanations for syndromes and symptoms, that we're not diluting, that we're adding. So a preponderance of just so stories will not advance my field. Wealth of very alluring, superficially plausible, but ultimately untested and untestable models of mental pathology. I think if predictive processing can go beyond this, and I do believe it can, I think we need to show what predictive processing brings that other models don't, what constraints it can impose on empirical studies, and what mechanistic commitments it can make, and how those can be tested. And on that note, I'll thank you very much for your attention and stop my sharing.